Okay, we are live.
Benedicite,
Manuscript. This is Deacon Joseph Swaden,
Bishop Enoch.
and we are going live on the question. I don't even remember how I titled this. It was like a pretty long title, but the whole point is we're going to finish off the Monophysite, arguments and discussion. We pretty much laid them out in a previous show. Close the Monophysite case, and I don't know if I put the dots. No, I still don't quite know what it's basically, the point of the show, after we finish off with the Monophysites, is we're going to talk about how to defeat 90% of papal arguments with one manuscript. That sounds ambitious, but it's going to be it's actually going to be very simple. Hi, Sean. And so I think that what's going to happen is once we explain exactly how important this manuscript is, it's going to become very clear as to why this is a very valuable text, and it's one you should keep handy. But in any case, so I guess we were going to start by talking about we dealt with Diophysite language before Chalcedon, and so we established, it's pretty much, conclusive that the Western Diophysite position before Chalcedon was reflected in St. Leo's tome, as opposed to St. Leo's tome being innovative. And this is very important to clarify, because the latest, I guess you could say, argument among the Monophysites, whatever you want to call them, is that Western fathers, in some way, shape, or form, that some of them held to a more Monophysite position. This is false, or that it's a Diophysite position that they approve of. It's not. We've conclusively, shown that it's not us. It was because you just look at the fathers of the West and you see that, but it's a tricky language because I think they kind of feel that they know that the de facto position of Miaphysitism is such a small, rejected, and minority position that they kind of have to prop it up, and sometimes they do that through misleading quotation. So that's we're going to finish up with that, and then we're going to get right to the simple but very important manuscript quote, and then we're going to expand on it a bit more. I know Bishop Enoch is looking for a text. So, but
I found it already. I'm fine.
Okay, great. Okay, so what would you say is left to say about the whole, the whole Monophysite thing?
Well, there isn't. Remember, this has been a debate between the Church and the Monophysites for nearly 1,500 years now, and all we're doing is repeating what the saints and fathers traditionally have said. And one of the things they've said, especially if you look at, let's say, St. Vigilius of Tapsus, who was a confessor for the faith. He reposed around 489, and he was persecuted by the Arians, and then he was exiled to Constantinople by them, and then he was persecuted by the Monophysites there. And St. Vigilius is important because he simply says, look, we've always been saying Christ is what, at least in Africa and Italy, Gaul, all these other areas, we've been saying the Son of God is one person in two natures. And you can look in earlier texts like St. Vincent of Lerins' Commonatory, St. John Cassian, and it's one person, two natures, one person in two natures. It's not just one person of two natures, it's one person in two natures. That language goes all the way back to St. Augustine. You can find it in St. Ambrose, who predates St. Augustine. So, you can even find some material in the 3rd century if you want to, talk about Tertullian. It was written in some of Tertullian's texts before he left the church. So it wasn't a controversial thing, if you know what I mean.
Exactly.
It seems to have been made a controversy beginning in the period after Ephesus and in the lead up to Chalcedon as Monophysitism developed. And part of that may be explainable by the fact that when Apollinarianism was defeated as a heresy at the Second Ecumenical Council, it kind of disintegrated by the 390s and early 400s, and a lot of Apollinarians kind of formally accepted orthodoxy, but they kind of didn't, if you know what I mean. And those people later took on the mantle of St. Cyril and, then wreaked a lot of havoc. Whereas there was no Nestorianism in the 360s or something like that in Italy or Spain or the Gaul. It was either Orthodoxy or Arianism, and the Orthodox were always saying our Lord is one person in two natures. And so when Saint Leo wrote his tome, it simply represents the view of the saints, you know, in the language-wise in the West going back some time. So, I mean, if they're saying one person in two natures for 50, 60 years before Ephesus for Chalcedon or even Ephesus, and in fact, as you know, you can just read the text. Leporius, the presbyter, who was a Pelagian, but also was a pre-Nestorian around the year 420. All right, people forget that Pelagius had a defective Christology as well. All right, and that was why the Pelagians, later called the Celestians, later allied with Theodore Mopsuestia in the 420s, and they basically attacked the memory of Saint Jerome. Theodore Mopsuestia did not like Saint Jerome, by the way. Neither did Julian of Eclanum. So the defeat of Pelagianism in the West under St. Augustine, St. John Cassian, and others, simply St. John Cassian says that we had already defeated Monophysite. We had already defeated Nestorianism when we defeated Pelagianism, because when they made Leporius the presbyter around 420 sign this declaration, all the bishops of Africa accepted it, his repentance, where he said one person in two natures and expended on it. All the bishops of Gaul accepted it. It was not controversial. So I don't know what more to say. If you want to elaborate, it's kind of an old.
I was kind of done with it with the last show, Vladika. I mean, to be quite honest with you, I don't think that there's a tenable case there. Mm-hmm. I have presented, you know, that last video to certain, you know, Monophysite, whatever, you know, on Twitter, and they basically said we'll respond after Lent, which, okay.
Well, we're done with it for the moment, so we can move on.
Exactly. So, you know, we're going to get to the main event of this particular show, and that is the big, gigantic quote. Since we, believe it or not, this quote has actually been sitting on your blog on Traditional Western Orthodoxy now for a little while, but we didn't talk much about it because, partially because of the fact that we started planning to do this show. Secondly, because I noticed that it is in fact effective when you use it in discussion with, you know, Roman Catholics. I tested it once or twice. There's really no answer to it. So I'm going to lay out the background real quick, and correct me if I'm wrong, Vladika. I'm going to go through basically how most papal arguments are defined when they're talking about the Roman Catholic Pope. They're usually defined along the lines of Father X said something about Peter, and this demonstrates, because the Pope is Peter's successor, that clearly the Pope has this authority. And then usually the argument is based upon building around this concept of the monarchy of St. Peter, which translates into the monarchy of the Pope. How am I doing so far?
They have to, all right, they establish the concept that St. Peter has a monarchy, like a dictatorship rule first, and then they oftentimes appeal to phrases in some of the fathers where St. Peter's called Prince of the Apostles, but they kind of neglect the fact that princeps didn't necessarily mean king or dictator. Mm-hmm. It meant, okay. Go ahead.
But the point is that, which regardless of, you know, that's a very good point. But this is where I feel like we get into the weeds when we start talking about princeps, and the whole point is that in general structure, the equation is always Peter equals the Pope. So all of these arguments are based fully around that. They're based really around conflating this kind of concept of papal monarchy with St. Peter himself. So that's basically where I'm with that in terms of discussing this. Now, what I want to get to is this. By contrast, the Orthodox teaching, and even at its most basic, most people will say that all bishops are the successors of the apostles, and Peter is not isolated in that sense. He's, then it gets, you can get into the weeds with, the trifold denial and confession later. But the point is that really that's kind of like most Roman Catholic argument when we're talking about the nature of the Pope. It always centers around Peter. It always centers around the Pope of Rome. and kind of mushing these two together. So that's really, I think, what I'm trying to establish. The Orthodox position has generally always regarded, all bishops being the successors of the apostles, the fullness of that power, and the lack of isolation in it. St. Peter not having a particular special charism in this, and we can go to Acts and so on and so forth. But the point is, the real question, and ultimately it comes down to psychology, is if you feel comfortable enough saying that, the Pope is Peter, so on and so forth, it becomes a much harder gulf to breach, because basically, many bishops have failed historically in the church. The apostles all ran. So, the point is, if you convince yourself that there's a special narrative with Peter, if it's not patristically valid, it's still psychologically comforting. Does that make sense?
Yes. I've not been a papist ever, so I'm looking at it from the exterior, trying to understand it. Now, is that the experience you had when you were in?
I would say that massively, and I think that almost every former Roman Catholic who has become Orthodox has struggled with the question of the Pope and Peter. Because ultimately it is the foundation of the Roman Catholic religion, and we can see that now. We're going back to Hildebrand for one last time next week to look at a bunch more sources. But the point is, the system that he set up intrinsically is there in the Dictatus Papae, and that is a monarchy with the Pope as Peter at the top. So this is very, very important, because even ultimately people who were Roman Catholic or are Roman Catholic and are considering Orthodoxy tend to see it as the Rome versus the East, Peter versus the other apostles. In other words, they do not there's a big gulf of separation, and from their perspective, this is what the West has always taught. And so, that if you hold a different view, it's an Eastern view. And so it allows you to psychologically buffer yourself and protect the idea that this, you've got, you have an assurance of sound doctrine because you've got quote unquote Peter on your side, if that makes sense.
Okay, well, let's move on to the text material.
Sure. Okay. Well, I actually I have the Western Orthodoxy blog up. And so I'm going to actually just put it. And since you wrote it, Vladika, I mean, you can read it. I would prefer you did. You
have to give me the link to it. I don't have it up.
Oh, yeah. Let me do that. Give me a moment. And so I will put that in the private chat before I put it up on the screen. And so there it is. Okay. You should be able to see it. And then I'm going to share screen, because this is a cool feature that we can now use. And I am going to do that. So hold on. No, not that one. This one, and let's share a screen. All right, so here we are.
All right, well, essentially what we're looking at is a text that comes from the Pontifical of St. Egbert of York. Now, Pontifical is a Western Rite book. It's kind of equivalent to maybe a bishop's euchologion, you might think.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if Hieroticon or something, a service book that only a bishop would use. And in it, especially if you have a book that's for a metropolitan or an archbishop, the material, the text would contain the service for the consecration of a bishop, because as a rule, only an archbishop or metropolitan would be the one needing that. Obviously regular ruling bishops or auxiliary bishops wouldn't be consecrating bishops without the permission of their metropolitan. Okay, so in the text, it has the enthronement service that's done after the consecration of a bishop. Now, really, for a ruling bishop, we're talking about a ruling bishop, since only a ruling bishop is really enthroned. We're not speaking in the sense of a vicar bishop or such. So, in the service for the enthronement, now, an interesting point here is that many Roman Catholics, if they claim to be traditionalist Roman Catholics, aren't familiar with a real substantial enthronement service for a ruling bishop in the Roman, even in the Tridentine period. And that's because by the time you get to the Tridentine Pontifical, Pius V, and as far as I understand, the only enthronement they had was they would set up a fold stool in front of the altar, and they would sing the Te Deum. They would set the new bishop in it, and Te Deum would be sung, then a few preces and a collect, and that's it. Okay. Whereas if you go up into the 13th, 14th, 15th, kind of right on the verge of the pre-Reformation period, they actually had a service that dates back to at least the 7th century, if not earlier, where a bishop was formally enthroned in the cathedra of the church for which he was consecrated for. Okay, so just establishing that, because oftentimes if you look on like the Wikipedia article for enthronement of a bishop, it'll say there was never an enthronement service in the West. It's totally false. I don't know who wrote that. I mean, every time I try that, anyone tries to change anything, it never goes through anyway. So that's why I've given up on Wikipedia to some extent. Anyway, so after the consecration of a bishop, now there's a mistake in the article. It says, now notice how the metropolitan, when enthroning even an auxiliary bishop, that's actually a mistake. It should just say bishop of a that's a mistake on my part. So no auxiliary bishops here. Okay, so when a metropolitan enthrones a bishop, and he takes him to the cathedra, okay, to the throne. Generally, the throne should technically be located what's called an apse, which is behind the altar. It can be located in the choir. And as the metropolitan or the archbishop, the one delegated to do this, puts him in throne, he says, the metropolitan calls him a successor of the apostles, a successor of Peter, who, though first placed in the chair of priesthood, later has this chair filled equally with all the apostles. Quote, and at last, thou, through thy Son, Jesus Christ, hast set the holy apostles, firstly the apostle Peter, upon the chair of honor, and hast counted Matthias as having equal share with them in the apostleship in the chair of honor, and raised him to the number of all the holy apostles. We beseech thee, for the sake of thy limitless mercy, grant grace in our times unto our brother in the name of the bishop, to be equal to thine apostles, thine holy apostles, sitting upon the seat of honor and dignity, that in the sight of thy majesty he may appear worthy of that honor. The metropolitan prays that the new bishop may be an apostle of Christ, and that he may receive the blessing and apostleship. Do you want to add anything else, Father Joseph?
Yeah, no, I think that what we're trying to establish here, and it sounds like it sounds difficult to kind of parse, because
now just to note, you can look. I have the whole service. I tried to type out any text, my typos in my, but I think I got them all. I typed out the whole service at the bottom of the post. You can read through it yourself, and it's contained in the, let's say, the Pontifical of Saint Egbert of York, who was the first Archbishop of York, actually, because York was just a regular. It was meant to be an archbishopric, but it only got raised to one around like 750 or something. And so in England, let's say there were two metropolitans in Britain. One was of Canterbury and one was of York. So whenever these metropolitans would consecrate a ruling bishop and enthrone them, they'd use this service. All right. Now, also, if you look in what's called the Sherborne Pontifical, which is from the late 900s, sometimes called the Pontifical of St. Dunstan, since he owned it, you have the same service, exact same service that's contained in it. Now, interestingly, in one of the prayers, when the metropolitan sets the new bishop in his cathedra, the metropolitan says, upon this thy servant, whom thou hast appointed prelate of this apostolic see, and primate of priests, and teacher of thy universal church, and hast chosen to the ministry of the highest priesthood, thou wouldest bestow this grace, that he might ascend the pontifical cathedra to rule thy church and all her people. All right. So now, interestingly, even the bishop, let's say Durham, Exeter, some rural place, was being called what? A prelate of this apostolic see. All right. And a primate of priests, and that's interesting. Now, well, interestingly, if you look in the Ecclesiastical Saint Bede, now I'd have to look for the exact quote, but Saint Bede at one point calls Canterbury an apostolic see. All right. Now, however, if you look in some later Roman Catholic translations, they don't translate that correctly. They just say like Rome. When if you look at the context, he's actually talking about Canterbury as such. So there was a way in which not just Antioch, Alexandria, and Rome were called the Apostolic See, but oftentimes people applied that title to metropolitan sees or even smaller sees, if you know what I mean. Okay, go ahead.
But what this basically says, and if you're looking at this text, and I put in the link, is that a Western pontifical, one that was being used, and as Bishop Enoch has pointed out, The Sherborne Pontifical is that the other one?
Well, the Sherborne Pontifical was originally the Pontifical owned by St. Dunstan, but after he reposed, it was given to Sherborne. And Sherborne is really kind of what we call is really coterminous to some extent with Old Sarum. Anyway, just for historical reasons. But this you can also find this text in French pontificals as well. So it wasn't distinctly, Anglo-Saxon or something like that. Okay.
Right. But the point I'm trying to make is what we're establishing here, just through this manuscript, is that Western bishops were enthroned into what was understood by their metropolitans as apostolic sees, and more importantly, that they shared in the ministry of the apostles, such as St. Peter being the first and St. Matthias being equal with them. This is all in one text. The point is that throughout Europe, and we can definitely establish all of England and part of France just off the bat, this was the way they enthroned bishops. I don't know when you seem to know when they stopped. But
there's another text called the Magdalen Pontifical, which is like the very end of scholars will consider the Anglo-Saxon period extending to about like the year 1100. This just before the Normans took over everything, I guess. But let's say the Canterbury Pontifical, which was late 11th century Canterbury Pontifical, which is sometimes called the Pontifical of Magdalen College, just because it was owned by Magdalen College. Which belonged to Anselm, and I don't endorse Anselm, obviously. They have the same service. So this enthronement service was being used even past up into the 12th, 13th, 14th, 5th, up into the 15th century. I think up into England, at least, up into the Reformation, I believe. I think I did look in the pontifical, one of the Canterbury pontificals from like the year 1500, they had it there. Now, I think it all kind of disappeared, especially after the Tridentine period.
Yeah.
So, and that would most likely signal, there was the counter-ref. I mean, obviously, it's still not the church, even when they were using this in the 1500s.
Of course.
But it signaled that these are kind of like leftovers, if you know what I mean, kind of remnant things. And so once the Tridentine Reform happens, the Counter-Reformation, all that stuff begins to happen. The Vatican is able to enter its, maybe third phase, you might say. I mean, there was the first phase, which I think would be really the 11th century, kind of Hildebrandine stuff. I think a second phase would have been the aftermath of the Great Western Captivity or whatever, and the Great Western Schism and all that other stuff that happened in the late 1400s. And then the last phase, the third phase being basically Counter-Reformation, reacting to the Protestant heresy, but, obviously they're heretics as well. And then trying to consolidate power under what? Under basically circling the wagon. So the Vatican's gradually strengthening its grip, if you know what I mean.
Right. But what we can see in the earliest Western texts is that the teaching of that was being proclaimed at the enthronement of the bishop was exactly the same as the Eastern teaching. It was not somewhat different. It references St. Peter itself. So the point is, the Roman Catholic self-understanding that bishops in some way, shape, or form was subservient to the Pope is an invention. It's not real. And so the point is, when confronted with that, there's very little one can say. And this is why I say at this point, it's a psychologically disconnecting manuscript and the psychologically disconnecting series of manuscripts, which is why they had to be removed. It wouldn't,
Well, and something to bring out also would be that if you look at, as you go into the period after the Great Schism, you go into the late medieval period, then the Renaissance, then the Counter-Reformation, there's this continuous move by the papacy to reserve more and more titles and privileges to. Now, this all began. If you ever read, what's the name of the Portuguese guy who wrote Tentativa Theologica?
Pereira. I think
Pereira points this out. He says that in the 13th, 14th century, all these bishops began to quote unquote give reservation to the apostolic see, as he says it, and which eventually gets to the point where when people hear the word Pope, well, who do they think of? They think of just the guy calling himself Bishop of Rome. Well, even when they see the word Pontiff, all right, they think of what? Who? The Bishop of Rome, the so-called Bishop of Rome.
Right.
They think of the word vicar of Christ. Well, you know what? That term was actually used universally of all bishops. That the bishop sat in place of Christ in the cathedral. I mean, he wasn't to like replace Christ. He wasn't an antichrist, but he was, kind of the symbolizing Christ. He was Christ exercised his priesthood through the bishop. All right.
He was the icon of Christ.
Exactly. That's a better way of saying it. But all these forms and terms were gradually reserved to, guess what? Eventually, the guy calling himself Pope. So that I think last year you had a little conversation on one of the Facebook groups, in which there was somebody who was some Spanish gentleman, and he was quoting, I guess, a patristic text that was rendered into
He was
Spanish.
actually, I think he was quoting. He was
Saint
quoting
Cyprian.
from the. Was it Saint Cyprian? I could have sworn
Well,
it was
the
quoting.
text
from,
said the text said, the pontiff shall do this and this, and the Spanish text said the
Right.
Pope. All right. Whereas the word pontiff,
I think that was actually
word pontiff is simply what? It's simply the Latin functional equivalent of hierarch. All right.
Yeah, or bishop.
Yeah.
And that was I think that was from the Passionary. It might have been, but the point is, the Spanish was literally just translated the Pope as opposed to the bishop, which is what it should have been translated to. But again, the reason this text struck me as so important is because it forces a psychological disconnect. It forces a person to have to say, wait a second, if Western fathers did not believe that the Pope of Rome was the only apostolic see, but that all bishops shared in the Petrine ministry and that all bishops had their own apostolic see, then how could the position of a Roman Catholic saying, well, any reference to the apostolic see or any reference to Peter can only be applied to the Pope, how can it even be considered tenable? And so that's kind of why it was kind of a big deal to me when I realized it. I was like, this is actually kind of, I mean, it caused me a psychological disconnect because even though I don't even believe in that stuff, I know what I used to believe, and it was completely demolished. It's not real. And I think that's why it's very important, if you are discussing it with a Roman Catholic, not to push the issue too hard because it is psychologically affecting. And the best thing to do is leave them to think with it, because ultimately they have to rethink their understanding of patrinity, their understanding of apostolicity, and whether or not the papacy even fits the criterion that the Western fathers themselves used.
Mm-hmm.
So if there are any questions, of course, comments, etc., please leave them in the chat. We will do our best to answer them. Let's see here. Past that, let me think here. I did do a kind of a pre-show show. I was actually doing something where I was answering Eric Ibarra, his thing from Reason and Theology. It was the last thing, like Eastern Orthodox objections to the papacy. And I mean, from a true Orthodox standpoint, it was all pretty easy to answer. I tried to answer from all vantage points because what I wanted to establish, and again, this text is helpful in that, is that Roman Catholics, regardless of stripe, tend to see their orthodoxy coming from a place and not from the faith itself. And so because of that, there's a huge disconnect in understanding. And as I said, it's a difference in paradigm. Because from an Orthodox perspective, we come in to learn, to understand, and to protect the true faith. The faith itself is an independent thing. It is not attached to an office. It is not attached to it. The faith is the faith is the faith. And I feel like that's something that definitely needs to kind of be hammered home in these discussions, because that may be why you see significant numbers of Roman Catholics so confused. It's because they look at it as Rome versus the East, and that never leaves them when they convert. But ultimately, what we need to focus on is the purity of the true faith. And if you do that, you'll eventually get to Orthodoxy, because it's the only place that does preserve the true faith, because that's literally our job. It's not like, for lack of a better word, it's not like a secondary thing. I mean, it's like if you if you look at how the Roman Catholic Church is designed, and this is, I mean, we're going to talk about Hildebrand, and then hopefully we can deal with other heresies, because we dealt with the Monophysites for a while. We've dealt with the Roman Catholics a long while. Talking about Protestantism would be interesting. The point is, I want to establish that for our Roman Catholic listeners and people who want to argue with us, you must have a fundamental understanding that the faith in Orthodoxy is what makes us who we are. It defines us. Less so than who we're in communion with or who we're under. For that matter, they reference that in the objections. They reference the First, Second Synod. So the point is,
how did they reference the First, Second Synod?
Well, it was towards the end of the video where basically, like, I guess Michael Lofton asked Eric, like, what answer can you give in terms of, the faith? He was asked, like, if you have bishops who are heretics, but the faithful are still there. And Eric correctly pointed out that, although he got the numbers wrong, but that's not a big deal, that the First, Second Synod makes very clear that you have the ability to leave bishops who are heretical, and that it's your duty to do so. So, he actually was basically saying, my fear is that if I ended up leaving Roman Catholicism, I'd end up becoming one of these true Orthodox people. And we gladly invite you. It's not that, I mean, it's like, it's not, I mean, when one lives in a paradigm where you kind of got, your regular Roman Catholics and your Sedevacantists and your Diamond Brothers and so on and so forth, yeah, it might be terrifying, I mean, because, I mean, some of those people are nuts. Not that we don't have, yeah, I know. Not that, no.
To me,
not that.
Well, Canon 15 of the First, Second Synod is an interesting canon, because if you look in St. Nick, if you go on, I can put it up right here, but it's interesting just to speak about it for a little bit here. I'll put it in the private chat. You can put it in the public chat or whatever.
Okay. Put it on the screen. Yeah,
if you got on Canon 15, I've got it already listed there, but it references, St. Nicodemus references Apostolic Canon 31. And going off memory, Apostolic Canon 31 says that if any priest shall set up an altar against his own bishop, unless it be for reasons of faith and piety, he shall be deposed. Okay? So, but notice, it has that exemption, faith and piety. Okay, now I'd have to look up Apostolic Canon 31 exactly to give you exact wording. But even back during the time of the apostles, and even if you don't want to accept the apostolic canons as being that of the apostles, let's say 3rd, 4th century, if you want to claim that, it tells you that the idea was that if your bishop is teaching things that are condemned by the fathers and the councils, you cannot just simply say, well, hopefully it'll go away in 20 years or something like that, So my point was, this was not something invented by St. Photius and the bishops in Constantinople in 861. What they did do, though, is they made sure to narrow the reasons for separating from one's metropolitan or ruling bishop down to the dogmatic issue, if you know what I mean. Because if you look at the previous canons, they say you can't do this, you can't do that, and all the rest. And that's because there had been this period going back to, the late 790s, early 800s, sometimes called the Noachian Schism, in which one of the emperors, I think you may know about this, some have discussed this before, in which one of the emperors wanted to get married like a third or a fourth time, I can't quite remember. And the Patriarch Constantinople was like, I can't do this. And then he's like, well, then a priest did it, and then the priest got excommunicated, and St. Theodore Mopsuestia, sorry, forgive me for that. St. Theodore the Studite, not Theodore Mopsuestia. He's a heretic. I don't want to say that. I'm getting my people confused for a second. God forgive.
You confused your Theodore.
Exactly. There's a number of Theodores, but St. Theodore the Studite was like, oh, we can't do this, and he would not communicate with bishops who were recognizing this like third marriage. All right. And I think what happened by the time you get to 860, at least this is what some people believe, that they thought, well, this is not really a dogmatic issue saying you object to the third marriage. It's really an issue of kind of just discipline. And so they wanted to say, look, unless it's for an issue of heresy, you cannot separate from your bishop. All right. So it actually now that's interesting, because if you go back into the 500s, let's say when Pope Pelagius I was elected pope, and I think we've discussed this before, the majority of the Roman clergy and monasteries and laity in Rome would not accept his consecration. They would not accept him being pope, validly pope. And not because they accused him of dogmatic error, but because they said that he had essentially taken part in poisoning Pope Vigilius, right? And that he had made some secret deal with the emperor to get made pope by, I guess, killing Vigilius or something like that. It was all turned out to all be wrong, but they did eventually go back into communion. Now, by the way, Pope Pelagius was consecrated by like 2 bishops. None of the bishops of the suburban sees, like Ostia, etc., would have anything to do with them. So they had to find like 2 bishops out in the middle of rural Italy to come in. One was like 98. He had known years ago to come, consecrate him. And they had the only person of the Roman clergy they could find to help was the archpresbyter of Ostia. Who all he could do was just simply maybe help hold the gospel book, but he didn't lay on hands. Holding the gospel book is not the same as being a co-consecrator, by the way. They later recognized him. But then again, if you go back to the 490s, there's this period in which I think Pope St. Anastasius II have this situation where there was an archdeacon, Photius of Thessalonica, if I remember his name correctly, who came from Thessalonica, and he was received by Pope Anastasius II like in 498 or something. And he allowed him to concelebrate. Archdeacon serves, obviously. He wasn't, he was concelebrating in that sense. However, a lot of the Roman clergy almost immediately cut off communion with Pope Anastasius II. Now, why? Well, because this Greek archdeacon had been ordained by, I think, Acacius of Constantinople. And technically, there was no communion between Rome and Constantinople over Acacius and then his successors until 519, essentially. And so they said, well, he was ordained by this heretic. He never was made to sign a document renouncing the heresy. And for the Pope to then allow him to serve at Mass, at his own Mass, is the equivalent of taking part in this heresy. All right? And so anyway, you can multiply examples of that. That would be more of a doctrinal accusation against Anastasius II, whereas the one about Pelagius would be, he was kind of an evil guy. That's really not a good justification for ceasing commemoration of a bishop if you're just saying he's not a heretic, if he's, But then again, you could argue that in the case of the 550s, when Pelagius I was elected, they were saying his election was invalid to begin with, if he basically murdered the previous pope to get elected. And he didn't even have, I think, a majority of the cardinals with the cardinal clergy to elect him.
Were there cardinal clergy at that?
They called them cardinals. They didn't mean it was like the conclaves and the papacies we think now. But each major see, often, for example, each see would have important cardinal. They would be called cardinal clergy. Cardinal comes from a Latin word, I think, which means to hinge almost. All right.
Oh, okay. These are the seven
there'd be 7 archdeacons of Rome. There was 7 subdeacons, I think, too, who were important. There were used to be 7 archpresbyters, but I think the number got more and more over time. And then you would have lay people who were patricians that were important in the election. All right. Now, of course, it sounds like it's a democracy, but ultimately the other bishops, like let's say the Bishop of Ostia, who had the privilege of being the consecrator of the man elected back in the 500s to be Bishop of Rome, he and the other bishops could simply say, look, we don't accept the election, and we're not going to consecrate anybody. All right. So we don't have this democratic understanding in the modern sense, but there were electors that exist, yes, for different seats. But then, of course, the metropolitans could simply nullify that if they had to.
Overrule, yeah. But
then, of course, you would have a situation where there might not be no bishop for a see for some time, and that would have to go to negotiations and such. Anyway, not to go too far, but it does show even then, 490s and 550s, people did not have this idea that, well, this guy claims to be the Pope, and so we just got to stay with him no matter what, if he's a heretic. Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
I'm going to get to a question because it relates to it. Atomic Lead asks, ignoring the issue of ecclesial supremacy, how do you approach the idea of the Pope's temporal power and his authority to delegitimize monarchs and absolve their subjects of loyalty? I mean, the simple reality is that all started with Hildebrand. I mean, that is part of the entire history of the investiture controversy was Hildebrand's struggle against the emperor, and that was why the election of Clement III took place. So you really find all of this in the Dictatus Papae.
Now, interestingly, to back up that real quick, during the Hildebrandian schism, many of the Hildebrandians said, well, didn't Pope St. Zachary depose the Childeric, I think it was the last of the Merovingian kings, and put, was it Pippin to be the first of the Carolingian Frankish line? And Benzo of Alba and several others answer this very well. And they point out from the documents that, no, that's not what happened. I mean, historians will try to say that was like a backroom deal, it really happened. But even if it was this weird backroom deal, guess what? It was a backroom deal because they realized the Pope and other bishops did not have the power to depose a king. So, but what on the surface at least happened, and this is back in what, 740s, I think, 750 when this happened, was Childeric, who was, I guess, maybe he was a child at the time, a teenager maybe, agreed to, in fact, relinquish the throne legally, okay, and to take monastic vows, and he did. And at that point, he had no children, so the closest relative, I guess, would have really been Pippin, I guess, and so he was technically made, king of the Franks at that point. And Pope Zachary, approved it. All right, but that's not really the same as that. What Pope Zachary didn't do is he didn't say, "I declare officially that Childeric is excommunicated, and I'm going to install this other guy because I have supreme temporal power." All right, if you know what I mean, Father Joseph. Hello. I don't know if I have lost.
No, I do. I understand.
Okay. Anyway, I'm just saying
I'm here.
Sometimes that's brought up.
No, I'm here. I'm here.
Okay, but anyway, that's really you're seeing that with the first time under Hildebrand, because remember, back in the 1040s, people forget, and though we've mentioned this, papacy was in this just malaise, horrible situation for almost 150 years before like 1054. Going back to Octavian, so-called John the 12th, who was in fact deposed, by the way, and ascended in Rome in 963. And then, of course, you remember they had the demon in human form, as he was called, Benedict IX, I believe, elected in like the 1030. He made pope when he was 17 years old. He was like 10 times worse than Theophilus Lecapanus. And no one really knew who was really pope, because all the popes were deposing each other, murdering each other. How would you determine who was in fact the valid patriarch of Rome? And what had to happen, as I recall, was Emperor Henry III, who I believe, and he was obviously the predecessor of Henry IV, who I think is the one that happened during the whole Walk of Canossa and all that other stuff. He came to Rome, and the Romans, the clergy and nobility of Rome in the 1040s, were so happy to see him, because generally there were these internecine conflicts between the different families, and if the emperor from the Western emperor ever showed up, generally people were afraid something bad was going to happen because somebody had gotten in trouble or something. So anyway, they were all very happy, and as a result, there was a man called Clement III, I believe, who had been a German archbishop, who was elected willingly by the Roman clergy to be Clement III. And I think it was
Clement
only
the third or second.
Clement II. Okay, and there was this great rejoicing in Rome in 1047, I guess 1046, and they even brought out the old green mantle of the emperor, and they put the green mantle on Henry III, and they put upon him the crown, and then he and the others helped and did the service to help install Clement II, and everything seemed to be a lot better. Of course, then Leo IX becomes pope, and things began to get much worse thereafter. Although there was continuously, interestingly, this party that I don't even think accepted Leo IX, or they didn't like him near the end. And Benzo of Alba talks about that. Maybe Guido Ferrera, I can't quite remember, where they said Leo IX was Hildebrand's man. Right? Now, I don't necessarily think they were calling Leo IX this evil guy, but he was kind of considered basically a do-nothing puppet, if you know what I mean by that. Well, he could just
Well,
be
now
bossed
it's
around.
worth noting because a lot of people.
Now,
It's worth noting a lot of people
Michael
thought that Leo
Carolarius.
IX.
Now, by the way, Michael Carolarius himself. Now, I'm not exonerating Leo IX. I think he had some part. But remember, Michael Carolarius himself did not believe Leo IX was actually writing all these letters condemning him. He believed this was all people basically behind the scenes who hated him, his political enemies in Constantinople, combined with people like a Humbert and others, which either shows you that Leo IX was just this master politician doing it, or he really was this kind of, let me be frank, this kind of buffoon that was being used and he either willingly or not. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, we know that that's the case, effectively, because we know that Hildebrand at the time was kind of working behind the scenes until his election, which many people considered illegal at the time. So,
well, the accusation was he murdered Alexander II.
yeah,
it was the one that he stripped.
he had him poisoned. Yeah, he had him poisoned.
Yes. So and remember, if you go back to remember, there was this opposite party. Now we're getting into the next week's show, but we can do a little bit of it without going too far into it. Remember, there was this party going back to the late 1050s that elected, I think, a Benedict X. Maybe he was elected in opposition to Leo IX, or maybe the guy after him. But there were successive groups of clergy and bishops who did not even recognize Leo IX. Now, Benedict X is interesting because even England at one point recognized him. So, for example, when the Great Schism happened, technically England was not considered in communion with Leo IX. And then they later recognized Benedict X, who was kind of this competitor to the Hildebrandian line. But then there was this third competitor line that was kind of like another portion of the old Roman party that was pro-imperial and sometimes considered pro-Byzantine. And that was led by Bishop Cadalus of Parma, who was called sometimes anti-Pope Honorius II. All right? And one of his big supporters in Italy was the chancellor, the imperial chancellor in Italy, was Wiebert, who later became Archbishop of Ravenna. So when people bring up Clement III or Wiebert of Ravenna, he wasn't just going along to get along. He had been opposed to a bunch of this stuff going back to the 1050s. There were a lot of people who did not like what was going on. So it's all very important, interesting to get into that. And in fact, I believe when Wiebert became Archbishop of Ravenna, he was invited to Hildebrand's so-called Lenten Synod in like 1072. And then he came there. Yeah. Now, they claimed he signed some kind of agreement. I don't know if that's true, but thereafter, he and the rest of the Lombard bishops broke off from Hildebrand. So either the so-called Gregorian Reformer Hildebrandian party just said, oh, no, he came to the Synod. Therefore, he did what he agreed to, supremacy of our jurisdiction or group. Or the fact is, maybe he went there, he didn't like what he saw. He and the Lombard bishops, who were basically all of northern Italy, up into parts of modern-day Switzerland and such, came back and they're like, well, this Hildebrand guy, he's crazy. We're not going to deal with him. Because remember, it'd be very strange for Wiebert of Ravenna to suddenly go from being the hardline pro-Honorian party to going to this Lenten Synod and then becoming pro-Hildebrandian there, and then coming back and being anathematizing Hildebrand. All right, so leave that as. Now, interestingly, one of the reasons Cadalus, or Honorius II, as he was called, wasn't he was powerful and had supporters, but one of the reasons he didn't succeed is that the imperial government in Germany at one point simply dropped him, and I think what happened was under maybe Nicholas II, or if you give me the names of those guys between Hildebrand and Leo IX, I could probably tell the name. Maybe Alexander II. One of them agreed to some sort of terms with the imperial government in which they would recognize.
That was Alexander II.
Yeah, I think what happened is something happened where he made some kind of concordant with the emperor in Germany, and a lot of the imperial support, official government support for Honorius kind of dried up, and he was left on his own. But although Honorius, to the day he died, was like, I'm the valid pope. These other guys are heretics. And Benzo of Alba, who was from that old party, he died in 1089. He was the bishop of Alba, but he was driven out of Alba by the Patarines, who were basically a crypto-Gnostic group that were used by the Hildebrandians and allied with them to basically attack all the Mary clergy and kill and murder them. They even caused riots in Milan under this man named Ariadolf, who was considered a saint by the modern Roman Catholic Church, who they were killing Mary clergy. And then eventually what happened is that when Ariadolf, I think his name was on the road, he was beset by some Mary clergy who had their family members or family killed, and he was beaten and he died. and then he was later declared a martyr by the Hildebrandians and such like that for their cause. But it's kind of like a martyrdom, like Joseph Smith martyrdom, or what's his name, the Joseph Kuncevich martyrdom. You go into town, you hang a bunch of people, and then the relatives get angry, and someone hits you in the back of the head with a hammer, and you die, and then suddenly you're a martyr after you've murdered a bunch of people.
Yeah.
So but Benzo of Alba, if you look in what's translated of his work against the Hildebrandian schism, and for the Emperor Henry, the work is called, I believe. He says,
we're going to definitely touch.
But just real quick, all I want to say is Benzo of Alba, writing in this period, firm pro Catalan and then pro Wiebertine, so called. He says that all these guys going up back to Leo IX were just creatures of Hildebrand. He doesn't have a very good opinion of them. He calls them schismatic heretics, as far as he was concerned. Now, in later texts, some people try to claim Benzo of Alba agreed in essence with Hildebrand's reforms, but if you look at a lot of those commentaries that say that, what they're pointing to is Benzo of Alba might say in a letter to the emperor, like, now, Your Majesty, remember when we're electing bishops, let's make sure they're men of good morals. Let's make sure that the clergy are men of good morals. And they'll say, you see, he supported the quote-unquote reform of the clergy. Well, simply supporting reform of the clergy in the sense of making sure good people are ordained, that's not the same as, I don't know, driving out all the people who were legitimately married. That's that kind of modern interpretation of it. Anyway,
it's anachronism.
Yes.
But we're definitely going to touch upon all these texts. I know that you're really excited about that because we've got a lot more data. You found a lot more data, and I think what we're going to do. I think even
Guido of Ferrara, or either Guido of Ferrara or Benzo of Alba, in one of their books, states that doesn't everybody they say something like, doesn't everybody remember when the Pope and his bishops, he's speaking in the abstract, were once in great concord with the bishops in the East, but now look at the situation? That he doesn't say anything more than that.
Yeah.
Right? So that tells you at least a lot of these people were implicitly blaming the Hildebrandians for the whole break with the East to begin with. Which is true. If you're dealing with somebody who believes a pope, if you're dealing with, let's say, the Honorian Wiebertine party, if they already acknowledge a pope can be deposed by a council, and they already acknowledge all these restrictions on his power, the very concept of them sending someone like a Humbert would not have happened to begin with. Anyway, that's all we're saying. Go ahead.
Well, somebody EAN7 said a papist said Christ left his church in charge of Peter to confirm his brothers to the faith, and that he entrusted the rest of the apostles with the task of announcing the gospel and administering grace through the sacraments, but only Peter left him the necessary mission to confirm the true doctrine. Basically, I would tell your said papist friend to watch this show from the beginning, and wish him good luck. Somebody said, aren't you guys a schismatic true Orthodox? There's no name to it. Aren't you guys a schismatic true Orthodox? I'd say we're the non-schismatic true Orthodox.
Asking somebody is, well, it's like me asking, aren't you kind of a schismatic heretic, ecumenist member of the Moscow Patriarchate? They're like, no, we're not that.
Yeah. It's
kind of presupposing someone has to acknowledge they're schismatic and how they answer the question.
Yeah, we're not like sitting here like, yeah, schism. It's like that's not what we're doing. We just try to maintain the Orthodox.
Well, if
faith.
they accuse us of being schismatic, they presume that we believe the same thing as they do.
Well, you also have to ask. Well, I've always pointed this out because we're a Western metropolia. Who are we in schism from? Technically, you would have to establish that. We're not part of the Church of Greece, so we're not in schism from Greece. We're not part of the Church of Russia.
To establish schism, you have to also establish that that party believes the same things as the group you say they're in schism from. Now, if I can establish I don't believe the same doctrines as Bartholomew or Kirill, then either I'm a heretic or they're a heretic. That's as clear as can be.
Right. It's not an issue of schism. So, in any case,
all right.
I think, do we have any other?
Now,
issue of who's in heresy and who's in schism are two different things, though.
Yes. You can have schismatic heretics, but then you can have plain schism. But again, this is something people, for some reason, don't want to talk
exactly.
about. I don't quite know it because, anyway, I do kind of know. But anyway, now let me give an an argument that you might hear from the papists on this point. Can't some papists, Father Joseph, say something like, well, Rome is, the Pope is the successor of Peter in a special way, but the old bishops are successors of Peter in a general way? I don't know if, won't that be something some of them will try to say, in that the enthronement servant just speaks in a generalistic way?
I would say that you'd have to establish where that difference exists, and I don't think that most of the patristic texts that are used can support that thesis. You have to specifically be talking about jurisdictional ones. It limits a lot of the texts on the matter.
Well, for example,
because usually when you're dealing a lot with.
Mm-hmm. So, for example, if we let's say,
well, what I was saying was simply that. I'm waiting.
Oh, okay. Well, for example, historically in the church, you can say that Saint Peter was a bishop and was ruling bishop to some extent in Antioch, and so wouldn't the bishops of Antioch would have some sort of kind of a historical succession they could claim to be a successor of Peter in some kind of narrative historical sense, right? As opposed to just them being a generalistic successor of Peter.
Well, I think, and this is why this text is so interesting, because they would argue that, Antioch is not the apostolic see. And we could get into the arguments, that St. Leo understood the apostolic see to be tripartite. But this manuscript itself demonstrates that every see is an apostolic see. And so the meaning is completely different than what a Roman Catholic usually thinks it is. And that's why it's so damaging.
Okay.
Let's see. Somebody asked, do you think a calendar removes grace? And I assume he meant removes, because then he corrected himself. I don't say that a calendar removes grace, because a calendar is a calendar. The question is why I would say you can't canonically change a calendar, because there's no good reason to do so. But the heresy is not in changing the calendar. The heresy is the motivation behind the change of the calendar. And the purpose for changing the calendar was ecumenism. It's really that simple.
Yes, if you go back to the 1920 encyclical of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, he says that the Ecumenical Patriarchate states that the reason the calendar is being changed is what? To have unity with the heretics of the West. That he doesn't call them heretics.
Yeah, and it's not... And you don't just have to listen to us on the matter. I mean, technically, the official Church of Poland literally switched back to the old calendar by basically saying the 1920 encyclical was invalid and they don't subscribe to it anymore. So it's not like what we're saying here is like that far off left field. You just have to kind of actually hear what we're saying, and you'll realize that it's a rational point of view that, believe it or not, is still held by the majority of even World Orthodox on Earth, since the new calendar has comprised like 10% of the Orthodox world.
But if the question is, does the calendar create a situation where there's automatic loss of grace, I'd say no. In fact, I don't think most people who identify true Orthodox would claim that. But it's a complicated question.
There might be a couple, but they're not that
would
bright.
Be some, because obviously ROCOR allowed back in the 50s and 60s, the new calendar diocese and the Romanians and things like that. And they had this one Romanian church, Metropolitan St. Philaret, used to take care of in France up into the 70s or 80s, that used the new calendar or something like that. Anyway, it's a more complicated episode. I think we've actually discussed this in an hour and a half episode.
I think we have. Yeah, we did. I'd look up calendar among our previous shows.
What's the motivation for it?
That's the main thing.
The motivation for the calendar is not because they want to make it more astronomically accurate. It was for ecumenism and modernism. That's the plain motivation. So,
Atomic Lead asks, the usual argument is that Peter died at Rome, so it's more properly patrine or apostolic, and it inherits his authority uniquely. Well, that's precisely why a Western pontifical that can be commonly found throughout the West counteracts this argument, because ultimately, if you're looking at what the bishops of the West thought before the schism and even immediately after of their own authority. It's this concept that's being brought up is a novel argument. It has no weight. So that the problem is it's not a very good argument, especially when you're talking about patrine or apostolic authority, because it refers to both.
Well, even if you want to say the Bishop of Rome was a successor of Peter in a special historical sense, and St. Peter's bones are there, for example, his relics are there, that doesn't translate into what? The supreme monarchy, all right? I mean, no more than St. James, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, can be called the successor of James means what? I mean, do they inherit all the powers of the people who established that see? Well, first off, there were people in Rome to begin with before St. Peter came there. There was, I believe, St. Linus was bishop there originally, or St. Clement. You could debate that question. But anyway.
Well, somebody wrote this. No name person says, I've read the bad motivations behind the calendar change, but it isn't dogmatic at all. Again, the 1920 encyclical Unto the Churches of Christ Everywhere, you can read it. The astronomical accuracy arguments began much later. If you want to hold to the astronomical accuracy arguments, I really have nothing to say about that, except that I think that scientifically it's wrong.
And also, is ecumenism a heresy today or not?
Yeah, ultimately that's what it comes down to.
I mean, it's not like, they changed it and then they didn't do anything after that. I mean, is Patriarch Bartholomew a heretic or is he? So.
Yeah, so I mean, and it's not something that we're a big fan of discussing, because I know that people who are outside of Orthodoxy, for the most part, love the whole new versus old calendarist argument. Honestly, I would suggest just investigating.
To be honest, and that's really an argument within the Greek religious world. Because if you go into Russia, the Russian true Orthodox, the arguments aren't over the calendar, right? And they are, in fact,
that's because they all have the same calendar.
In fact, I should point out that in Greece, every now and again people talk about the calendar, but ecumenism, modernism went so far in Greece. The calendar is like, even if the official, most true Orthodox in Greece are going to say it doesn't matter if the state church goes back to use the old calendar. If they don't anathematize ecumenism and modernism, then you can. I mean, the Coptic church uses the old calendar, so it's about the motivation for it, and it's about modernism and ecumenism. So if you think it's just a debate about 14 days, then I think you have a problem with understanding what happened in Greece in the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s. What's the issue in Greece even today? You have an issue of understanding, let's say, what happened with the Catacomb Church in Russia, and they didn't. Just because Sergius was using the calendar, the same calendar, doesn't really mean anything to them. There are really dogmatic issues here. So the dogmatic issue is whether you can commune with heretics or not, whether you can pray with heretics or not, whether the Orthodox Church is the only true church, or whether it's not the only true church. And if you say it's the only true church, yet you're still doing joint prayers and joint services and saying you have an ecumenism with papism, then you really don't believe it's the true church. So, I mean, it's as simple as that.
Yeah.
If you believe in Orthodoxy,
that's honestly, well, I was going to simply say that, I mean, this is a debate that's occurring internally in world Orthodoxy right now. So, I mean, there's loads of people you could have that debate with.
Well, they're where true there are a lot of those people, especially in Ukraine and Russia, have been allowed to have been allowed by their official establishments to go way out and say all kinds of things like the Fanar is graceless, it's heretic. You can't commune with it, which is their technical official position, without giving too much ideas behind it. Yeah, even some of them are trying to recapitulate kind of Chrysostomos of Florina's ideas back in the 30s.
Well, I think that's more the high level organs, but I'm thinking in terms of things like I mentioned this in the previous thing about when Kirill met with Pope Francis in Cuba.
And signed the declaration they were brothers in Christ.
Right, but there were like mass protests in Russia,
mass non-commemoration, not non-commemoration.
Right. Well, that is, non-commemoration is a protest.
Now, I think we can tie this to the program because remember, the Papists, their error was to tie Rome unity with what an institution. That's the Romans. That's the so-called Roman See, to having unity with the Church. Right, Father Joseph, to saying that's one of the errors.
Exactly.
So whether you say it's unity with this one see, or it's unity with 4 or 5 sees claiming to be patriarchs, or 7 or 8, is the faith found in those places, or is it found in other places? Is it tied inextricably to those places, or is it not? Do you have it?
No,
do you have
it's
what? Do you have a very externalistic, institutionalist understanding of the body of Christ as an organism, or do you not? The church can make use of institutions. That's true, but it's not tied to those institutions. In fact, you see in every major heresy, this is the problem that happens throughout history over and over again. You go back, let's say, not too long ago to the Melkite heresy system, in which the
I brought that up.
the institutional Melkite Antiochian Patriarch, which was called the Melkites, in mass apostatized and joined what? They joined the Vatican, okay, leaving no bishops left in Antioch, and they had to send monk Sylvester to be made patriarch by the Patriarch of Constantinople, and they kind of had to reconstitute everything. But institutionally, they were the Antiochian Patriarch in this externalistic sense, not in a real sense. You can find the same thing throughout history. The Monophysite patriarchs, the Arians, one thing after the other, where the heretics take over the official institutions. They then say everybody who's not with them is a schismatic or heretic, and their only argument is we're the institution, we are official, and you really believe the same things we believe, and if you don't, you're going to be in trouble. Okay,
now, this person asks, I'm in ROCOR myself, and my main question for true Orthodox is whether or not being in communion with possible heretics regards you losing grace and being a heretic. I would say if you're asking the question of whether it's possible, effectively, then you haven't made enough of a distinction to make that determination. So my point is, for us, we've made that determination. So it's not a question of possible. If it is possible, then basically you're kind of in a catch-22, because really ROCOR was Orthodox in 2005. It's kind of weird to say that they're not Orthodox now, but you'd have to extrapolate that from their communion with the Patriarch. Now, they entered into communion with the Patriarch with Alexei II, who was not nearly as bad an ecumenist as Patriarch Kirill, who was the head ecumenist for the Moscow Patriarchate at the time. I would be in a very weird place if I was in ROCOR, but I'm not. So I don't.
Now, historically, it's not quite more he wants the answer for, but can there be situations in which some Orthodox church enters in communion with heretics, but it doesn't lose grace, only if they don't know those people are really heretics or they're deceived?
Well, he finishes it off by saying, if so, then you have an enormous problem. If not, then all the TOs should be the non-commemorators instead of breaking off and falling into schism. Also, I don't approve of Kirill's ecumenism at all. But that's my point. We were the non-commemorators. Then we established a hierarchy. That's how it always works.
Obviously, that's the problem. If the bishops you're not commemorating are heretics, and sees fall into heresies, you have to get new bishops eventually. Unless you're going to get ordinations from heretical bishops, which is not an acceptable form. But, for example, like in the 360s, here's an example. Pope St. Liberius, who made another mistake. But anyway, there was a group of bishops called the Macedonians who came to him. And a delegation was led by Eustathius of Silva. There was Silvanus of a few others. So, Eustathius, Sebastius, Silvanus of Tyana, etc. And they came to Liberius and they said, okay, Pope Liberius, we will have union on the basis of the Council of Nicaea. Okay? And Pope Liberius, the bishop's like, well, I guess this is good. There's this group of Arians that want to say they're going to accept Nicaea. And so they signed the documents, all right? Well, they were Macedonians, which we know is a group that denies the divinity of the Holy Ghost. Okay? And so for all the Macedonians suddenly rushed to join in the East with all the bishops that were directly in communion with Pope St. Liberius, okay? And this creates a massive problem, all right? In which St. Basil, I think in one of his letters says, what is Liberius, what are these people doing? Don't they know that these Macedonians don't accept the divinity of the Holy Ghost? Now, the truth is, either Pope Liberius, I don't think he was knowingly going to enter in communion with heretics, and the only options then are he didn't know. Well, just the only option is he didn't know, or he just didn't do the proper investigation. About 4 or 5 years later, what happened? Everybody kind of discovered Macedonius, kind of going back to even regular Arianism, and the whole thing was broken off. Although all these massive Macedonians had melded into even some of the groups in communion with St. Basil, and they had to, kind of deal with that issue. But can you have? I'm just saying. I'm answering the question: can you be in communion with possible heretics, but it not affect you? It always will affect you, but will it have an automatic loss of grace? And I'm saying only if you don't know they're really heretics, if you know what I mean, Father. If someone deceives you,
No, I would.
yeah, that's the only case. I mean, for example, St. Athanasius, St. Liberius, they would not, if Arius himself or Macedonius had come to him and said, we don't believe in the divinity of the Holy Ghost, we don't believe in the divinity of the consubstantial Son, will you sign this agreement with us? They would have said, absolutely not. All right? So
Well,
if you're arguing on the basis of ignorance, that's different than arguing on the basis of what? A kind of knowingly doing something. Because
right, and one of the
patriarchs can make mistakes and not having all the right information, but generally in history that doesn't last more than 10, 15, maybe 20 years when people began to find stuff out, if you know what I mean.
And this is exactly my point, is that ultimately most heretics, and we've even experienced this when we've dealt with heresy in the past, because even in the past 20 years,
up. They don't quiet for very long.
And they're not quiet for very long, but they generally always lie. So the truth ends up coming out later, and then people have to figure out what to do with it. I'm going to skip your next question, dash, because you don't have a name, and I'm going to get to it in a second because I want to give other people a chance. Antium Magnum says, Papists are attacking me because I'm converting to Orthodoxy, sending me texts telling me that the Pope of Rome is the successor of Peter, etc. Should I bother replying? There's two ways to answer that. One, if you don't really care about what goes on with them, or you don't take what they're saying seriously, then the answer is no. If you do, or you want to actually help them understand why you're becoming Orthodox, I suggest going to the beginning of our channel, sending them parts 1 and 2 of Who Invented the Roman Catholic Church, and next week's show. Just send them the links, tell them to watch it. Most of the time they'll ignore you, in which case you should just ignore anything further. If they don't, they'll probably have a lot of questions and they'll want to learn more. This is an interesting one because now I'm going to follow that up from dash. For example, Metropolitan Philaret in his last liturgy commemorated the Patriarch of Jerusalem. The Patriarch of Jerusalem commemorates CMP, yet Philaret clearly condemns CMP. The problem is that Patriarch Diodorus.
Do we know that? Do we actually have documents that he commemorated him in the last? I mean,
he didn't say. Well, I think he's just making a guess because he says, he said the Patriarch of Jerusalem can commemorate CMP. Sure, but Patriarch Diodorus and Patriarch Theophilus are not the same person. Patriarch Diodorus communed with Old Calendarists, so I have no idea who he was commemorating, and unless you can prove that, then that just leads to the confusing situation.
We can bring this back to an historical argument and such, but I think it might be better to point out that the Roquefort mission, technically back even in the 70s and 80s, I think they did commemorate the Patriarch of Jerusalem, at least the Roquefort mission, I believe. What was the name of it? I believe that did happen. And so they might say, well, they're commemorating it, and even in their communion with Metropolitan Philaret, and this is kind of, well, technically, from a very technical point, you can say that Canon 15 only says what? Ceasing commemoration of your bishop. It doesn't say technically ceasing commemoration of the guy in communion with the guy in communion with your bishop. Now, I know that I'm not endorsing. I'm saying that's later extract. It's just like Canon 15 doesn't give a whole complicated laid out procedure for how to go if things get much worse. All right.
Right. You'd have to use a historical.
This is the first step, and there are historical precedents of what to do. For example, I'll give you an example. Marcellus of Ancyra, all right? One of the original bishops of Nicaea was Marcellus, Bishop of Ancyra, all right? He was a pro-Nicene original bishop, persecuted by the Arians, etc. Well, St. Athanasius was always a big supporter of him, except for 3 different times. What happened is this. Marcellus of Ancyra, the Arians would always accuse the Orthodox of being what? Sabellians, okay? Well, it turned out Marcellus of Ancyra was pretty close. He was actually a Sabellian, according to many. And so this kind of gave a bad name to Orthodoxy. And St. Athanasius had to break communion with him 3 times at one point. So was St. Athanasius in this period before he really understood what was happening each, different time? When did he lose grace? I don't think he ever lost grace, obviously. But if you're asking, I don't know how that all works out. If they're asking us what is the strict to Orthodox, whatever old calendarist view on this matter, I don't think anyone has come up with an exact answer, because we're relying on historical precedents in the church, where oftentimes the only exact answers you're going to give are going to be things like, was so-and-so, let's say, for example, Auxentius of Milan, all right? That's another weird situation. He was an Arian imposed upon the Church of Milan in the 360s or 37, I think. Okay? Now, however, people knew he was an Arian. They heard things he said from the pulpit. But then, when other bishops would try to get him on it, guess what? He'd say, "No, I didn't say that."
Right.
And then the witnesses they'd have these trials, and because here's the problem: if you have, then a trial, okay, and then at one point there was a trial of 12 bishops appointed by the emperor in area, and they asked him, "Will you sign the Nicene Creed?" And he's like, "Sure, I'll sign the Nicene Creed." Well, guess what? Then he can officially claim he's Orthodox. But St. Hilary of Poitiers brings this out explicitly. St. Hilary of Poitiers was like, Exentius is anathematizing me. He's saying I'm a schismatic because I won't commemorate him. I won't celebrate with him. But you know what? He can do whatever he wants. I'm telling all the people in southern Gaul and in northern Italy, don't go to churches commemorating him. Go to your own houses. Go to caves. Just don't deal with him, because he can claim these things in trials and he can claim he signed these documents, but I don't believe him. All right? So that's an example, let's say, a complicated situation where Exentius is condemned as an Arian. I think at one point Rome, maybe under Pope Damasus or Liberius, was like, look, we've had enough with Auxentius. He says one thing and does another. We're just cutting off communion with him. But then again, other bishops were saying, well, he says he's not an Arian. So at what point, did that filter down through everything? And I have no idea. It's like asking me when the Great Schism happened, when did if a priest in Iceland was celebrating Mass a year later and he didn't know what had happened, was his Mass valid or not? I would say if he didn't know what was happening and he was just going off, that God gave a grace to him, extended that to him. That's just my own.
I think that a lot of people, when they try to understand our position, they end up hearing about the light switch position, which is probably the most, most problematic of old calendarist positions. I believe it was first introduced by the Matthewites, the former Matthewites in that mixed synod, the Callistite synod, where basically it's like, oh yeah, grace just vanishes, and somebody said, how does it vanish? And one of the bishops basically flipped the light switch and said like that.
Well, now it's interesting, because I think you can point out instances in church history in which that does happen. And I'll give you an example. The iconoclasm and heresy. Iconoclasm was anathematized in 729 and then again in 731 in Rome. And within, I guess, a year, not long after, all the other patriarchates, like, we're not dealing with this guy, Constantinople, and people in communion with him, they're heretics. And that was like within a year at least that all happened. All right. Because I guess it was just so blatant, if you know what I mean, Father.
But again, it wasn't even.
Go ahead.
But my point is, there were actual reunion councils between different groups that had rejected iconoclasm that weren't in communion with each other. Well,
that same thing happened in the Arian heresy too. You had, for example, Saint Basil at the end of On the Holy Spirit talks about how you had all these groups of Orthodox who could say they anathematized Arianism and Macedonianism, all these heresies. But then they ended up all attacking each other because they were always trying to claim that, oh, you got consecrated by this guy who was technically had one time celebrated or commemorated this guy who did this with this other guy who was an Arian. All right. For example, St. Jerome, I'll give you a perfect example. And this, because in this, by the way, we can relate this to the papacy issue again by this, the modern papist position does not make sense when you look at, let's say, how the fathers and the saints reacted to Arianism. Okay, you can say, oh yes, Rome stood against Arianism, at least in the as far as they knew. I mean, although technically Liberius did sign this other document condemning St. Athanasius, which is why, in fact, in the West, most calendars never included Liberius on their calendar. There were some, although St. Athanasius later accepted Liberius' apology. All right, and St. Liberius is on the calendar of saints, by the way. But you had all these groups in the East that were not in communion with who? With Rome. All right. For example, I don't think there's any evidence that Saint Basil died in communion with Rome. As far as I know, Saint Meletius wasn't even in communion with Rome at the Second Ecumenical Council. Technically, Rome didn't have any representatives at the Second Ecumenical Council.
Right. They didn't
because they didn't accept Saint Meletius, because they were saying Saint Paulinus of Antioch was the real bishop of Antioch, and Saint Paulinus of Antioch's position was that Meletius is a heretic, and I'll baptize people coming to him from me, and I'll reordain all his people.
Sound
that's
familiar?
How I'm going to treat them. And it got to the point where Saint Meletius was like, I've had enough of this. I'm just going to start reordaining people who come to me from you. And St. Jerome points out in his chronology, for example, St. Jerome, who lived in Bethlehem for some time, never liked St. Kirill of Jerusalem. St. Jerome's view, even to when he, as far as I can tell, even up to his repose in 420, was St. Kirill was basically kind of, it was not true, objective, was basically kind of this fraud. Yeah. That he was claiming to be Orthodox, but he was just claiming anything so he could get a position. Because St. Jerome says it was well known that St. Kirill, after he left, after St. Maximus, I believe, Jerusalem died, that the Eusebius of Caesarea, who was the one of the leader of Acacius of Caesarea, who is called the tongue of the Arians by St. Gregory of Nazianzen. People wouldn't even pronounce his name; they so disliked him. That Acacius said, "Look, now that this Maximus guy is dead, I'll make you bishop of Jerusalem, but you're going to have to let me reordain you through all the orders, and then I'll make you a bishop." And St. Kirill, unfortunately, the St. Jerome says, accepted it. And this created a bad taste in among a lot of people in Jerusalem who were like, well, we're not going to have anything to do with Kirill. Now, St. Kirill can honestly say about 2 years later, he basically broke communion with Acacius of Caesarea, who was technically his primate. Jerusalem wasn't a patriarchate at the time. And at that point, St. Kirill, he allied eventually with St. Meletius of Antioch. And there was this group of like second-generation bishops came after Nicaea that had gradually rejected Arianism, if you know what I mean, or it's a very weird position. And they were basically opposed to, let's say, St. Athanasius. They weren't opposed to him, but they were opposed by bishops like St. Paulinus, bishops in communion with St. Athanasius, people like, sometimes scholars called the Old Nicenes, all right? So, yes, I mean, I can say that there's these complicated situations that happen. It doesn't fit the institutional understanding, let's say, of how the papacy understands the church. But guess what? It doesn't fit the institutional understanding of how people in the 20th century have tried to define what orthodoxy is as being in communion with, patriarchates. Instead of 1 see, it becomes, 7 sees, 10 sees. But we see how that broke down when people could claim, the Fanars is in communion with these guys in Ukraine. But then people say, well, that doesn't matter.
Yeah, exactly. So, look at and that, ironically, it is this complex situation that is making it so difficult. But
it's a laziness. This is the problem. People got lazy, but about trying to explain ecclesiology, trying to explain church history, because they're like, people don't understand this. They're never going to understand it. It's just too complicated to explain what happened, these heresies, etc. So let's just give them a very simple answer. Well, the problem then, what happens? If you give people a simple answer,
it's usually wrong.
Yeah, it can be wrong. It's wrong. And then guess what? They believe other simple answers. Yeah. And then those simple answers are even worse than everything that sins.
I think that perfectly relates to our next question. And it is, do you think a lot of young converts err nowadays by focusing too much on theology and reducing the faith to a mere philosophy rather than focusing on cultivating virtue? I would say that the church has always had a theological wing. It's always had an apologetical wing. And I think especially with, unfortunately, in the age of ecumenism, and this isn't just true among the official churches, but also among true Orthodox as well, I think there was an overemphasis on basically just focus on the liturgy. Don't think about the complicated things. If people want to think about the complicated things, I think they should. And I think they should do it in conjunction with their clergy. But that does not mean they shouldn't go to church. Of course they should. But there's nothing wrong with trying to understand the church's history and teaching better. I think it's okay.
You can't have a divorce between liturgy and studying the fathers. They're supposed. Because if you just say, well, as long as you go and do the services, everything will be all right. Well, it wasn't all right for the Melkites.
Yeah.
And it turned out disastrously. Now, I think there are some people who argue, for example, St. Augustine brings this point up either, I think, in maybe the City of God, where he says that there were some, he's talking about St. Anthony the Great without mentioning him. All right. He's talking about people like him, where he says there are people who were so holy, okay, knew the scriptures, the services, and they were so holy that they could almost immediately perceive the right answer to a question without even studying it. He says that's very rare. They were enlightened directly by the Holy Ghost to questions. And, there could be a heretic come to them, and before he says anything, they knew he's a heretic. All right? Yeah. Augustine says that's not a lot of people who get to the point of being a St. Paul of Thebes or St. Anthony the Great. Okay?
Exactly.
So you have to, most of us aren't going to reach those states of holiness where we're seeing the uncreated light on a daily basis. The angels are coming and conversing with us and telling us things.
So you have to know stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, now this is I think this should be the last question, unless more pop up. An interesting question relevant to most topics is how Rome persuaded Oriental Orthodox to become Uniates. What is their reasoning for rejecting the non-Chalcedonian heresy? I'm not really sure. I mean,
I know a little bit about it.
Okay, well, please go ahead, because I don't.
In the case of the Armenians, remember that was the Crusaders came and they conquered Accra, those areas, in the First Crusade. And I think what happened is the Armenians were like, well, these guys are going to offer us protection. And I think the Armenian prince gave one of his daughters to marry the one of the Crusader dukes or princes or something. And they just simply submitted. It was based upon what? Based upon the fact that they got money and protection. Also, probably the Crusaders terrified them a little bit.
Well, I think that he might be talking about the Oriental Uniates, the
my point is that with some of them, it wasn't anything more than what the Crusaders come and they just impose something on them. They're imposed on them. If you're talking about, let's say, the Coptic Uniates, like they were formed in the 19th century, I believe, the middle of the 19th century. The Coptic Uniates, that happened by a simple process of people like Dominicans, Jesuits, constantly going to Egypt, trying to find somebody they could convince. All right. They finally find some people they can convince. Maybe a Coptic priest, some monks, because you can do that with anybody eventually. Unfortunately, now of course they weren't Orthodox to begin with, in neither party, but and then they just say, well, now you're going to be, if we don't, sometimes in fact the Roman Catholics didn't accept the ordinations by the Copts because they claimed they messed something up, whatever. Right. But anyway, they would either they receive them as a priest, they'd make them as a priest, whatever, and then they would begin the Coptic Catholic Uniate Church. That's how it began. The same thing happened even with the Ethiopians. Like the Ethiopian Uniates were formed back in 1950 when they began to send some of the Latin Rite Ethiopians to simply, guess what, just learn the Ethiopian rite stuff. Okay,
that's the same thing that they did that with Russia too.
Yeah, so I mean, you can always find this one. You can always find a few people. The only big group of Uniates, of Monophysites that became Uniates, I think would be basically you're talking, because like the Syriac Uniates, they were formed the same way. Like they found somebody who got deposed or some disaffected person, and they kind of created something around him. But the Armenians, you did have 100,000 Armenians that accepted union with the papacy in the 1400s, and the Armenian. But it was really the Nestorians actually that were 1 million of them joined the papacy in 1595 or 1610, and that was actually over a dispute over who was going to be patriarch. So they had two different patriarchs in the Nestorians, and then one of them appealed to Rome, and they accepted union, and then it turned out that group later broke off, but a significant portion stayed with the Vatican over that and such. And now there were the Nestorians in India. There was this famous Portuguese mission. It's called the Synod of the Emperor, in which the Portuguese Roman Catholic just got all the Nestorians in one place and said, "You're going to submit to the papacy or else." And they're like, "Okay." So a lot of times these were not willing things, and if they were, you're talking about them building from scratch something like the Coptic Uniates or the Ethiopian Uniates or the Syro-Jacobite Uniates. They have to basically make the organization from scratch.
Atomic Lead commented, if just do the liturgy right and everything else will follow, were right, Vatican II and everything that followed wouldn't have happened. Yeah, that's true. Although I don't know that they were doing it the liturgy right to begin with there, but I do want to
have a right theology.
Yeah, but the point is that I do want to stress, because this is something that I've noticed. I have noticed with some people online that they become kind of Orthodox in name, but don't actually go to a church, and then they end up in confusion. You have to go to the church. You have to repent and be baptized. These are basics. If you don't do that, you're not Orthodox.
You can't simply say I converted because I now. You can't say I am now Orthodox because I listen to these guys on YouTube or in or Twitter or something like that, and now I'm convinced. That's not a conversion in a real sense.
Right. You have to actually go to the church, be received, enter into, get baptized and become part of the church. Otherwise, you're not there. You can't be Orthodox adjacent. You have to be Orthodox. So that's
people who say, well, I'm on Twitter, like, oh, I'm Orthodox, so I've converted all these people. Well, how many of those people actually are baptized?
They have to go to church.
Or they just saying, I listened to this YouTube channel or this BitChute channel or whatever, and I'm convinced of it. Well, those types of people, unfortunately, who have this highly intellectual, it's an abstract concept of orthodoxy, if you know what I mean.
Well, it could be that
they'll be convinced if they listen to another 40 videos by somebody else.
But the point is that they also, more importantly, people who are just suggesting that that is a valid form of conversion really need to go to church. It's that simple. You cannot become Orthodox if you do not join the Orthodox Church. I can't stress this enough because there could be people listening to this show who think like that, and I've got to just hammer that down. Yes, it is great to learn theology. Yes, it is great to learn apologetics. But if you have not physically joined with the body of Christ, you are not part of it. So that is something that I have to stress that. Because we've had a lot of confusion over that, not us personally, but I've seen a lot of confusion over that on the internet. Make that appointment with the priest and go to church. Find a way. In any case, and it's multiple people, quite a few I've seen. So I don't know where it's coming from. I'm not gonna talk about my suspicions, but theology, apologetics, these things cannot be separated from a life in Christ. You have to go. That it's just part of it. All right. I don't see any other questions. You see the comment, argue pre-Vatican II wasn't right anyway. Vatican II are not, they're schismatic. No, they're heretics. Next week's show will be helpful for that. Did you have anything else you wanted to discuss, Vladika?
No, not really, but I think the main idea is that the old bishops sat in the chair of Peter in the real theological sense. I think St. Cyprian of Carthage goes through this, actually, Father Joseph.
Yeah, he does.
And the chair of Peter is where the bishops sit. And, all bishops who are true bishops, who teach the faith, they are successors of the apostles.
Exactly.
And they have that authority, and it cannot be localized as an essential aspect of the church to one, two, or many sees. It's all bishops who are true bishops.
And that's
and the congregations under them, they're faithful, all right? Because whether you want to make monopapism or, multi-papism, all right, among guys who call them many popes or patriarchs, that's all equally wrong, is my point. And you're dividing, you're just recapitulating, unfortunately, kind of the papal error when you do this. And by the way, constant references people give to St. Maximus the Confessor, talking about St. Peter and the Pope of Rome, and things like, it shall not fail. As someone pointed out, St. Maximus also says something about, what the Sixth Ecumenical Council says also about, the gates of hell shall not prevail against the Orthodox Empire of the Romans, okay, the Roman Emperor. All right, so obviously they weren't understanding this in the, Hildebrandian or Pastor Aeternus sense, if you know what I mean, Father Joseph.
Exactly. Yep.
People have to be careful. Are they understanding things in the way it was understood then, or are they reading back into it ideas that weren't being held at the time? So,
all right. Well, if there's nothing else, I wanted to say thank you to everyone for listening, commenting, questions, and of course, if you haven't already, like and subscribe. And we'll be back next week to discuss the sources of the Hildebrandian takeover of the West that turned into the Roman Catholic Church. Okay, let's see. Okay, this is going to be the last question.
All right.
What if a convert does not have any Orthodox Church close to him, or the only one is ecumenist, such as the Greek Orthodox? What I would suggest in that situation, in all honesty, is to put yourself in contact with a good Orthodox priest, that if you know one, and begin to learn what's known as the Typica, until you can find arrangements so that you can go to the church. Because at least if you're praying with the church, we have in the Western Rite, it's called the Missa Sica. In the Eastern service, it's called the Typica. And you can always say the prayers of the church on Sundays, on weekdays, on fast days at home.
You can arrange for a baptism eventually, too.
Exactly. So the point is, it's nice to read. It's good to read the theological books, and it's good to read the fathers. It's necessary to read the fathers, but you have to be praying with the church. Get a pair of icons, get a lamp, begin doing the prayers on your own, and begin making arrangements for your reception, to be made a catechumen, to be made, to be baptized. If you're not doing that, it's still academic. Just because there's no church near you, and in the early 1900s, people traveled. In the 1800s, people would travel days, and this was before cars, to reach a church, to go once every couple of months if they could, because they were poor and they didn't have an opportunity. We don't even live in that era. But if there is difficulty,
remember St. Raphael Hawawini in one of his letters talks about the same situation among the Arabs and others he was charged with, in which they had no priest for a year or more, and children were being born, and priests would come and visit, and he'd say you have to pay for it, you have to arrange to visit the priest or have the priest come and visit you. They can do liturgy. I mean, they can arrange for baptisms at least and such like that.
Exactly.
So I mean, this is not exactly a new thing in church history. Look at Russia during let's say the 1400s, 1500s, even up to before the revolution. You had this massive territory in Central Asia that people didn't see a priest for 6 months, 7 months, 8 months. All right.
But that didn't just mean, okay, we can just go back to reading. You actually have to pray and do services, even if it's by yourself. And the point is, that is possible. So I would suggest getting in contact, as I said.
Everybody's become very comfortable with everything that modern transportation and technology has allowed, that they're forgetting that this is just like the disease. Now we're having the COVID-19 stuff. This is to be honest, Father Joseph, this is kind of the norm of history.
Yeah.
And we're spoiled with the last since the 1950s about, polio they got rid of polio, they got rid of this, they got rid of all this other stuff. And we're not used to, hundreds or thousands of people dying of some disease every year.
Well, I mean, yeah, but people are still dying every year of diseases anyway.
Yep.
And the point is, technology in this sense can be a help, because you can go and you can find the Typica, TYPICA, in Google. You can find the service text. Virtually all the service texts of the church are available in English. And if you're listening to this program, I assume that's what you speak and read. And you can start saying prayers. There's nothing stopping you from that.
And get in contact with a priest.
Yep, and that's what you do. All right. Is there anything else, Vodika?
Nope.
All right. In that case, thank you again for everyone listening, so on and so forth. Like and subscribe. Have a good night. Thank you for your questions, comments. Keep vigilant. We're in Great Lent, hitting the middle. At that point, have a good night, all.
Benedicite.